It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and the smell of sizzling meat filled the air. A family was enjoying a small backyard barbecue in their modest neighborhood. The sound of laughter and chatter mixed with the occasional sizzle from the grill. Kids were running around, playing tag, while the adults sat around a picnic table, sharing stories and enjoying the warm weather. It was the kind of day that felt perfect, until it wasn't. A few houses down, a neighbor sat by their window, glaring at the scene. This neighbor wasn't exactly known for being friendly. In fact, they had a reputation for complaining about everything: noisy kids, parked cars, even the way people trimmed their hedges. Today, the smell of barbecue smoke drifting into their yard was the final straw. They grabbed their phone and dialed the local police, reporting a disturbance and claiming the smoke was unbearable. Within minutes, a police car pulled up to the house hosting the barbecue. The officer stepped out, adjusting his hat, and walked up to the gate. The family noticed him immediately, and the laughter died down. The father, a tall man with a calm demeanor, stood up from the picnic table and walked over to greet the officer. He was confused but polite, asking if there was a problem. The officer explained that a complaint had been made about the barbecue, specifically the smoke. The father nodded, understanding, and apologized if the smoke had bothered anyone. He explained that they were just having a small family gathering and hadn't meant to cause any trouble. The officer, seeing how reasonable the man was, assured him it wasn't a big deal but suggested they keep the smoke to a minimum. As the officer was about to leave, the neighbor who had called the police stepped outside, clearly eager to see the situation escalate. They stood on their porch, arms crossed, watching intently. The father noticed them and gave a small wave, trying to keep things friendly. But the neighbor didn't wave back. Instead, they shouted across the yard, "It's about time someone did something about all this noise and smoke." The father paused for a moment, then walked over to the fence separating the two properties. He kept his tone calm and respectful, saying, "I'm really sorry if we disturbed you. We didn't mean to cause any trouble. It's just a family gathering, and we'll make sure to keep it down." The neighbor wasn't having it. They started listing off all the things they found annoying: the kids playing too loudly, the smell of the grill, even the fact that the family had parked an extra car on the street. The father listened patiently, nodding along, but it was clear the neighbor wasn't interested in resolving things peacefully. They wanted to make a point. Finally, the neighbor said something that caught everyone's attention. "You people think you can just do whatever you want, but this is a nice neighborhood. We don't need this kind of chaos here." The father's expression changed slightly, but he kept his composure. "I understand you're upset, but we're just trying to enjoy some time together as a family. We'll be more mindful in the future." The neighbor scoffed and turned to the officer, who was still standing nearby. "Are you just going to let them get away with this? They're clearly breaking some kind of rule." The officer, who had been observing the interaction, stepped in. "Ma'am, they're not breaking any laws. It's a public street, and they're allowed to have a barbecue as long as they're not causing a major disturbance. I've already spoken to them, and they've agreed to keep the noise and smoke down." The neighbor looked furious. "This is ridiculous. I pay my taxes, and I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of nonsense. I want something done about it." The officer sighed, clearly used to dealing with difficult situations like this. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do here. They're within their rights." The neighbor stormed back inside, slamming the door behind them. The father thanked the officer for his understanding and returned to his family, who were now sitting quietly, unsure of what to do. He reassured them that everything was fine and encouraged them to continue enjoying the day. As the barbecue went on, the mood slowly returned to normal. The kids started playing again, and the adults tried to shake off the awkward encounter. But the father couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. He knew this wasn't the end of it. The neighbor had made it clear they weren't going to let this go. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the family started cleaning up. The father was putting away the grill when he noticed the neighbor standing by their window again, watching. He gave a small nod, trying to keep things civil, but the neighbor quickly pulled the curtains shut. The father sighed and went back to cleaning up. He knew living in a neighborhood meant dealing with all kinds of people, but he couldn't help feeling frustrated. All they wanted was to spend time together as a family, and now it felt like they were being targeted for no reason. As he finished up, his wife came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let it get to you," she said softly. "Some people just like to make trouble. We'll figure it out." He nodded, grateful for her support. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The neighbor had made their stance clear, and he had a feeling they weren't going to stop until they got their way. Little did anyone know, this small conflict was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. The father had a secret, one that would soon come to light and change everything. But for now, the family packed up their things and headed inside, hoping the next day would be a little less eventful. As the night settled in, the neighborhood grew quiet. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. The father's expression changed slightly, but he kept his composure. "I understand you're upset, but we're just trying to enjoy some time together as a family. We'll be more mindful in the future." The neighbor scoffed and turned to the officer, who was still standing nearby. "Are you just going to let them get away with this? They're clearly breaking some kind of rule." The officer, who had been observing the interaction, stepped in. "Ma'am, they're not breaking any laws. It's a public street, and they're allowed to have a barbecue as long as they're not causing a major disturbance. I've already spoken to them, and they've agreed to keep the noise and smoke down." The neighbor looked furious. "This is ridiculous. I pay my taxes, and I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of nonsense. I want something done about it." The officer sighed, clearly used to dealing with difficult situations like this. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing more I can do here. They're within their rights." The neighbor stormed back inside, slamming the door behind them. The father thanked the officer for his understanding and returned to his family, who were now sitting quietly, unsure of what to do. He reassured them that everything was fine and encouraged them to continue enjoying the day. As the barbecue went on, the mood slowly returned to normal. The kids started playing again, and the adults tried to shake off the awkward encounter. But the father couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. He knew this wasn't the end of it. The neighbor had made it clear they weren't going to let this go. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, the family started cleaning up. The father was putting away the grill when he noticed the neighbor standing by their window again, watching. He gave a small nod, trying to keep things civil, but the neighbor quickly pulled the curtains shut. The father sighed and went back to cleaning up. He knew living in a neighborhood meant dealing with all kinds of people, but he couldn't help feeling frustrated. All they wanted was to spend time together as a family, and now it felt like they were being targeted for no reason. As he finished up, his wife came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't let it get to you," she said softly. "Some people just like to make trouble. We'll figure it out." He nodded, grateful for her support. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The neighbor had made their stance clear, and he had a feeling they weren't going to stop until they got their way. Little did anyone know, this small conflict was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. The father had a secret, one that would soon come to light and change everything. But for now, the family packed up their things and headed inside, hoping the next day would be a little less eventful. As the night settled in, the neighborhood grew quiet. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. The next chapter of this story was just around the corner, and it was going to be anything but ordinary. The next morning, the family woke up to a quiet neighborhood. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and it seemed like the previous day's drama had been forgotten. The father, however, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the neighbor lurking outside, ready to cause more trouble. But the street was empty, and everything appeared calm. Over breakfast, the family talked about what had happened. The kids, still a little confused, asked why the neighbor was so upset. The father explained that sometimes people get angry over small things, and it's important to stay calm and respectful, even when others aren't. The kids nodded, but it was clear they didn't fully understand. How could someone be so upset over a barbecue? As the day went on, the father tried to focus on other things. He had work to do around the house, mowing the lawn, fixing a leaky faucet, and organizing the garage. But every time he stepped outside, he felt a little on edge. He couldn't help but wonder if the neighbor was watching, waiting for another reason to complain. Around midday, the doorbell rang. The father wiped his hands on a towel and went to answer it. Standing on the porch was the same police officer from the day before. The father's heart sank. Had the neighbor called again? Was there another complaint? The officer greeted him with a polite nod. "Morning. I just wanted to follow up on yesterday's situation. Everything okay here?" The father let out a small sigh of relief. "Yeah, everything's fine. We've been keeping things quiet. No more barbecues for a while, that's for sure." The officer chuckled. "I hear you. Some people just like to stir the pot. But I wanted to let you know that we've had a few other calls from this neighborhood recently. Seems like your neighbor has been active." The father raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The officer hesitated, then said, "Let's just say they've been calling about a lot of things, noise complaints, parking issues, even reporting kids playing in the street. It's not just you." The father frowned. He had always tried to be a good neighbor, keeping his yard tidy, following the rules, and being friendly to everyone on the block. But it seemed like this one person was determined to make life difficult, not just for him, but for others as well. "Is there anything we can do?" he asked. The officer shrugged. "Not much, unfortunately. As long as they're not breaking any laws, they're within their rights to call us. But if it becomes harassment, that's a different story. Just keep an eye on things and let us know if it escalates." The father thanked the officer and watched as he walked back to his car. He stood on the porch for a moment, thinking. He didn't want to cause any trouble, but he also didn't want to live in fear of his neighbor's complaints. There had to be a way to resolve this peacefully. Later that afternoon, he decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. Maybe talking to some of the other neighbors would help him get a better sense of what was going on. As he strolled down the street, he noticed a few people working in their yards or sitting on their porches. He waved and exchanged friendly greetings, but he could tell something was off. People seemed a little more reserved than usual, as if they were holding something back. Finally, he stopped to chat with an older couple who lived a few houses down. They had always been kind and welcoming, and he hoped they might be willing to share their thoughts. "Hey there," he said with a smile. "How's it going?" The couple exchanged a glance, then the husband spoke up. "Oh, you know. Same old, same old. How about you? Heard you had a bit of trouble yesterday." The father nodded. "Yeah, just a misunderstanding. But it got me thinking, have you noticed anything unusual around here lately?" The couple hesitated, then the wife leaned in and lowered her voice. "It's that neighbor of yours. They've been causing problems for everyone. Calling the police, filing complaints, even yelling at people for parking in front of their house. It's getting out of hand." The father sighed. "I was afraid of that. I don't want to cause any trouble, but it's hard to just ignore it." The husband nodded sympathetically. "We've all been trying to stay out of it, but it's getting harder. Some of us have even talked about going to the homeowners association, but no one wants to make things worse." The father thanked them for their honesty and continued his walk. It was clear that the neighbor's behavior was affecting the entire neighborhood, not just him. But what could he do? He didn't want to escalate the situation, but he also couldn't just sit back and let it continue. As he turned the corner, he noticed a group of kids playing in the street. They were laughing and having fun, completely unaware of the tension in the air. He smiled, remembering what it was like to be a kid, carefree and full of energy. But then he noticed the neighbor's curtains twitch, and his smile faded. Were they watching the kids too? Would they call the police again? He decided to head back home. There had to be a way to handle this, but he wasn't sure what it was yet. For now, all he could do was keep an eye on things and try to stay one step ahead. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the father brought up what he had learned. His wife listened carefully, then said, "Maybe we should talk to the neighbor directly. Not confront them, but just try to have a conversation. Maybe they're going through something, and we can find a way to work it out." The father considered this. It wasn't a bad idea, but he wasn't sure if the neighbor would be open to it. Still, it was worth a try. If they could find some common ground, maybe the tension would ease. After dinner, he decided to take a chance. He walked over to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. For a moment, there was no response. Then the door opened just a crack, and the neighbor peered out. "What do you want?" they asked, their tone sharp. The father took a deep breath. "I just wanted to talk. I know we got off on the wrong foot, and I'd like to see if we can work things out." The neighbor stared at him for a moment, then said, "There's nothing to work out. Just keep your noise and smoke to yourself, and we won't have a problem." Before the father could respond, the door slammed shut. He stood there for a moment, feeling frustrated but also determined. This wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't ready to give up. As he walked back to his house, he noticed a car pulling into the neighbor's driveway. A man in a suit stepped out, carrying a briefcase. The father didn't think much of it at first, but something about the man's demeanor caught his attention. He looked official, almost like he was there on business. The father paused, watching as the man knocked on the neighbor's door and was let inside. He couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Was this related to the complaints? Or was it something else entirely? As he went back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. The neighbor's behavior, the mysterious visitor, the tension in the neighborhood, it all added up to something bigger than a simple barbecue complaint. But for now, all he could do was wait and see what happened next. The story was far from over, and the next chapter was going to be even more surprising than anyone could have imagined. The next few days passed quietly, but the father couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. The mysterious visitor he'd seen at the neighbor's house lingered in his mind. Who was that man in the suit, and what was his connection to the neighbor? The father tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on his family and daily routines, but the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. One evening, as the family was finishing dinner, there was a knock at the door. The father exchanged a glance with his wife before getting up to answer it. Standing on the porch was another neighbor, someone he hadn't spoken to much before. The man looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Hey," the neighbor said, his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" The father stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "Sure, what's up?" The neighbor glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening, then said, "It's about, you know, them." He gestured subtly toward the angry neighbor's house. "I think something's going on over there. Saw that guy in the suit again today, and he didn't look happy. I don't know what they're up to, but it's making me nervous." The father frowned. "Did you talk to them?" The neighbor shook his head. "No way. I don't want to get involved. But I thought you should know. You've been dealing with them more than anyone else." The father thanked him for the heads up and watched as the man hurried back to his house. He stood on the porch for a moment, staring at the neighbor's house. The curtains were drawn, as usual, and there was no sign of movement. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening behind those closed doors. The next morning, the father decided to take action. He couldn't just sit back and wait for things to escalate. He needed answers. After dropping the kids off at school, he drove to the local police station. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he hoped someone there might be able to shed some light on the situation. At the station, he asked to speak with the officer who had visited his house a few days earlier. The officer greeted him with a friendly smile and invited him to sit down. "What can I do for you?" the officer asked. The father hesitated, then said, "I'm not sure if this is the right place to ask, but I'm concerned about my neighbor. They've been causing a lot of problems in the neighborhood, and I think something might be going on. I saw a man in a suit visiting their house, and I don't know what to make of it." The officer's expression grew serious. "We've had a few reports about that house, but there's not much we can do without evidence of illegal activity. If you're really concerned, you might want to reach out to the homeowners association. They have more authority in these kinds of situations." The father nodded, though he wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer. He thanked the officer and left the station, his mind racing. The homeowners association was an option, but he wasn't sure if they'd be able to help. He needed to find out more about the neighbor and what they were up to. Later that day, he decided to do a little digging of his own. He started by talking to more neighbors, asking if anyone knew anything about the angry neighbor's background. Most people didn't have much to say, but one neighbor mentioned something interesting. "I heard they used to live in a different neighborhood," the neighbor said. "And they had the same kind of problems there. Always complaining, always causing trouble. I guess they moved here thinking it would be different, but, well, you know how that turned out." The father thanked them and continued his search. He even tried looking up public records online, but he didn't find anything useful. It seemed like the neighbor was a mystery, and no one knew much about them. Frustrated, the father decided to take a different approach. That evening, he sat down with his wife and explained everything he'd learned. She listened carefully, then said, "Maybe we're going about this the wrong way. Instead of trying to figure out what they're up to, maybe we should focus on bringing the neighborhood together. If we can show them that we're all on the same side, maybe they'll back off." The father thought about this. It was a good idea, but he wasn't sure how to make it happen. Still, it was worth a try. He decided to organize a small neighborhood gathering, nothing fancy, just a chance for everyone to get to know each other better and talk about what was going on. The next day, he went door to door, inviting people to a potluck dinner at his house that weekend. Most of the neighbors seemed hesitant at first, but when he explained that it was a chance to address the tension in the neighborhood, they agreed to come. The day of the potluck arrived, and the father was nervous. He wasn't sure how many people would show up, or if it would even make a difference. But as the evening approached, neighbors started arriving, carrying dishes of food and drinks. The backyard quickly filled with people, and the atmosphere was surprisingly warm and friendly. The father stood up to address the group. "Thanks for coming, everyone. I know things have been a little tense around here lately, and I thought it would be good for us to get together and talk. We're all neighbors, and we should be able to work things out without all the drama." People nodded in agreement, and a few shared their own experiences with the angry neighbor. It was clear that everyone was feeling the strain, but no one had known how to address it. As the evening went on, the mood lightened. People laughed, shared stories, and even started making plans for future gatherings. It felt like the neighborhood was finally coming together, and the father couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. But just as things were winding down, the angry neighbor appeared at the gate. Everyone fell silent, watching as they stood there, arms crossed, glaring at the group. The father walked over, trying to keep things calm. "Hey, we're just having a little get-together. You're welcome to join us." The neighbor sneered. "I don't need to join your little party. I just wanted to let you know that I've filed a formal complaint with the homeowners association." This kind of gathering is against the rules, and I won't stand for it." The father's heart sank. He hadn't even thought about the rules. But before he could respond, one of the other neighbors stepped forward. "Enough is enough," the man said, his voice firm. "We've all tried to be patient, but you're making life miserable for everyone. If you have a problem with us, let's talk about it. But filing complaints and calling the police isn't helping anyone." The angry neighbor looked taken aback, but they quickly recovered. "You'll see," they said, turning on their heel and storming back to their house. The father watched them go, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. This wasn't over, but he wasn't going to let the neighbor ruin things for everyone. The neighborhood had come together, and that was a step in the right direction. As the night ended and people started heading home, the father felt a renewed sense of purpose. They might not have solved the problem yet, but they were on the right track. And with the neighborhood behind him, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, the father woke up with a sense of unease. The neighborhood potluck had been a success in bringing people together, but the angry neighbor's threat about filing a formal complaint with the homeowners association loomed over him. He knew the rules about gatherings and noise levels, and while their potluck had been respectful and not overly loud, he wasn't sure how strict the association would be. He decided to take proactive steps to address the situation before it spiraled further. After breakfast, he called the homeowners association to explain what had happened. The woman on the other end of the line listened patiently and assured him that they would look into the complaint. She also mentioned that they had received multiple calls about the same neighbor in recent weeks, which made the father feel a little less alone in the situation. Still, he knew this wasn't going to go away easily. Later that day, the father decided to visit the angry neighbor one more time. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he felt it was important to try to resolve things face to face. He walked up to the neighbor's house and knocked on the door. There was no answer at first, but after a few moments, the door opened just a crack. "What do you want now?" the neighbor snapped, their tone as sharp as ever. The father took a deep breath, keeping his voice calm. "I just want to talk. I know we've had our differences, but I think it's time we try to work this out. We're neighbors, and we should be able to get along." The neighbor stared at him for a moment, then said, "There's nothing to work out. You people don't respect the rules, and I'm not going to stand for it." The father frowned. "We've always tried to follow the rules. If we've done something wrong, I'd like to know so we can fix it." The neighbor hesitated, then opened the door a little wider. "Fine. Come in." The father stepped inside, surprised by the invitation. The house was neat and tidy, but there was an air of tension that made him feel uncomfortable. The neighbor led him to the living room and gestured for him to sit down. "I don't like conflict," the neighbor said, sitting across from him. "But I can't stand it when people don't respect the rules. This is a nice neighborhood, and I won't let anyone ruin it." The father nodded, trying to understand. "I get that. We all want to live in a nice place. But sometimes, it feels like the rules are being used to target people instead of bringing us together. That's why we had the potluck, to try to build a sense of community." The neighbor's expression softened slightly, but they still looked skeptical. "Community is fine, but not when it disrupts things. I've worked hard to keep this neighborhood the way it is, and I won't let anyone change that." The father leaned forward, sensing an opportunity to connect. "I respect that. But maybe there's a way we can all work together to make it even better. Instead of filing complaints, we could talk things out and find solutions that work for everyone." The neighbor didn't respond right away. They seemed to be considering his words, but before they could say anything, the doorbell rang. The neighbor stood up and went to answer it, leaving the father alone in the living room. A few moments later, the neighbor returned, followed by the same man in the suit the father had seen before. The man looked surprised to see the father there but quickly composed himself. "This is my lawyer," the neighbor said, gesturing to the man. He's helping me with some legal matters. The father's eyes widened. A lawyer? What kind of legal matters could the neighbor possibly be dealing with? He stood up, feeling suddenly out of place. I should probably go, he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. The neighbor nodded, but the lawyer stepped forward. Actually, it might be a good idea for you to stay. This concerns the neighborhood as a whole. The father hesitated, then sat back down. The lawyer took a seat as well, pulling a folder out of his briefcase. He opened it and began to explain. My client has been dealing with a number of issues in this neighborhood, the lawyer said. Noise complaints, property disputes, and other disturbances. They've tried to address these issues informally, but the situation has escalated to the point where legal action may be necessary. The father's heart sank. Legal action? Against whom? The entire neighborhood? He glanced at the neighbor, who was sitting quietly, their expression unreadable. What kind of legal action? The father asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The lawyer hesitated, then said, my client is considering filing a lawsuit against the Homeowners Association for failing to enforce the rules. They're also exploring options for addressing specific individuals who have been causing problems. The father felt a surge of frustration. This was getting out of hand. I understand that there have been some issues, but I think we can work this out without going to court. We're all neighbors, and we should be able to find a way to get along. The lawyer nodded, but his expression was skeptical. That would be ideal, but my client has tried to resolve things peacefully, and it hasn't worked. They feel they have no other choice. The father looked at the neighbor, hoping to see some sign of willingness to compromise. But their face was hard, their eyes cold. It was clear they had made up their mind. I'll let you two discuss this, the father said, standing up. But I hope you'll reconsider. A lawsuit isn't going to solve anything, it's just going to make things worse for everyone. The neighbor didn't respond, and the father left the house, feeling more frustrated than ever. He walked back to his own home, his mind racing. What could he do now? The situation was spiraling out of control, and he didn't know how to stop it. When he got home, his wife was waiting for him. She could tell from his expression that something was wrong. What happened? She asked. He explained everything, from the conversation with the neighbor to the lawyer's threats. His wife listened quietly, then said, this is getting too big for us to handle on our own. Maybe it's time to bring in someone who can help. Like who? The father asked. I don't know, she admitted. But there has to be someone, a mediator, a community leader, even the police. We can't let this tear the neighborhood apart. The father nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. She was right. They needed help, and they needed it soon. But as he thought about what to do next, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was about to get even more complicated. Later that evening, as the family sat down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. The father went to answer it, and to his surprise, he found a group of neighbors standing on his porch. They looked serious, but there was also a sense of determination in their eyes. We heard what's going on, one of them said. And we're not going to let this happen. We're with you. The father felt a surge of gratitude. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. The neighborhood was coming together, and that gave him hope. But he also knew that the angry neighbor wasn't going to back down easily. The next chapter of this story was going to be the hardest one yet. The next few days were tense. The father and his neighbors held a meeting to discuss the situation. Everyone was worried about the possibility of a lawsuit, but they were also determined to stand together. They decided to reach out to a local mediator, a neutral third party who could help resolve conflicts without going to court. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. The mediator, a calm and experienced woman named Lisa, agreed to meet with the neighborhood. She listened carefully as everyone shared their concerns, including the father, who explained how the conflict had started with the barbecue and escalated from there. Lisa took notes and asked thoughtful questions, trying to understand both sides of the story. "It sounds like there's a lot of frustration here," Lisa said finally. "But I also hear a willingness to work things out. That's a good start." The days following the mediation meeting were filled with cautious optimism. The father and the angry neighbor, along with a few other volunteers, formed the committee Lisa had suggested. Their task was to draft a set of neighborhood guidelines that would address everyone's concerns. It wasn't an easy process, but for the first time, it felt like progress was being made. The first committee meeting was held at the father's house. The angry neighbor arrived with their lawyer, who sat quietly in the corner, observing but not interfering. The father had prepared coffee and snacks, hoping to create a relaxed atmosphere. He knew this was a delicate situation, and he wanted to keep things as friendly as possible. Lisa, the mediator, was also present to guide the discussion. She started by reminding everyone of the goal: to create guidelines that would help the neighborhood thrive while respecting everyone's needs. "This isn't about winning or losing," she said. "It's about finding a balance that works for all of us." The father nodded, then turned to the angry neighbor. "I think it's important that we start by understanding each other's priorities. What are the most important things to you when it comes to the neighborhood?" The neighbor hesitated, then said, "Quiet. Respect for the rules. I don't want to feel like I'm living in a circus." The father nodded, jotting down notes. "That's fair. For me, it's about community. I want my kids to grow up in a place where they know their neighbors and feel safe playing outside. I think we can find a way to balance those things." The other committee members chimed in, sharing their own priorities. Some wanted clearer rules about noise levels, while others emphasized the importance of community events. Lisa helped guide the conversation, ensuring that everyone had a chance to speak and that the discussion stayed productive. By the end of the meeting, they had a rough outline of the guidelines. They agreed on quiet hours in the evenings, clearer rules about parking, and a process for organizing community events that wouldn't disrupt the neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As the meeting wrapped up, the father turned to the angry neighbor. "I think this is a good first step. What do you think?" The neighbor looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "It's a start. But I'll believe it when I see it." The father understood their skepticism. Trust had been broken, and it would take time to rebuild. But he was determined to follow through on their commitments. Over the next few weeks, the committee worked on finalizing the guidelines. They held several more meetings, each one a little less tense than the last. The angry neighbor still kept their guard up, but they seemed to be warming up to the process. Even the lawyer, who had been so stern at first, began to relax and offer helpful suggestions. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was watching closely. The father made a point of keeping everyone updated, sharing the progress at informal gatherings and through a neighborhood newsletter. People were cautiously optimistic, but there was still a sense of unease. The threat of a lawsuit hadn't gone away, and everyone knew that one wrong move could undo all their progress. One evening, as the father was working on the final draft of the guidelines, his wife came into the room with a worried expression. "Have you heard the latest?" she asked. He looked up, concerned. "No, what's going on?" "I just talked to one of the neighbors," she said. "They said they saw a 'for sale' sign going up at the angry neighbor's house." The father's heart sank. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "They said it went up this afternoon. I don't know what it means, but it can't be good." The father leaned back in his chair, feeling a mix of emotions. On one hand, if the angry neighbor moved away, it might ease some of the tension in the neighborhood. But on the other hand, it felt like a failure. They had been making progress, and now it seemed like it might all fall apart. The next day, he decided to pay the angry neighbor a visit. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he felt like he needed to understand what was going on. When he knocked on the door, the neighbor answered, looking surprised to see him. "I heard you're selling your house," the father said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Is everything okay?" The neighbor hesitated, then sighed. "I've been thinking about it for a while. This neighborhood, it's not what it used to be. Maybe it's time for me to move on." The father felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry to hear that. I know we've had our differences, but I really thought we were making progress." The neighbor looked at him, their expression softening slightly. "You've tried. I'll give you that. But I don't know if it's enough. I've been through this before, and it never ends well." The father nodded, understanding. "I get that. But I want you to know that we're committed to making this work. If you're willing to give it a chance, I think we can create a neighborhood that works for everyone." The neighbor didn't respond right away. They seemed to be considering his words, but before they could say anything, the lawyer appeared in the doorway. "We're still considering our options," the lawyer said, his tone professional but not unkind. "But we appreciate your efforts. We'll let you know if anything changes." The father nodded, feeling a mix of frustration and hope. He thanked them and left, unsure of what to do next. As he walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something, either a breakthrough or a breakdown. When he got home, he called Lisa to update her. She listened carefully, then said, "This is a critical moment. If they're really considering moving, it could go either way. They might decide to give the guidelines a chance, or they might decide to cut their losses and leave. Either way, we need to be prepared." The father agreed. He knew they couldn't control the angry neighbor's decisions, but they could control how they responded. He decided to call a neighborhood meeting to update everyone on the situation and discuss next steps. The meeting was held that weekend, and the turnout was strong. People were anxious to hear the latest developments, and the father did his best to explain what was going on. He emphasized that they were close to finalizing the guidelines and encouraged everyone to stay positive. "We've come a long way," he said. "And no matter what happens, I think we've shown that we can work together as a community. That's something to be proud of." The neighbors nodded, but there was still a sense of uncertainty in the air. Everyone knew that the next few days would be critical. The angry neighbor's decision could change everything. As the meeting ended, the father felt a renewed sense of determination. They had worked too hard to give up now. Whatever happened, they would face it together as a neighborhood. The news of the angry neighbor potentially selling their house spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some people felt relieved, thinking it might finally bring an end to the tension. Others, like the father, felt a sense of unease. They had worked so hard to bridge the gap, and now it felt like all that effort might be for nothing. The father decided to take one last shot at resolving things. He reached out to Lisa, the mediator, and asked if she could arrange a final meeting with the angry neighbor and their lawyer. He wanted to present the finalized neighborhood guidelines and see if they could come to an agreement before the neighbor made any final decisions. Lisa agreed and set up the meeting for the following day. The father spent the evening preparing, going over the guidelines and rehearsing what he wanted to say. He knew this was their last chance to make things right. The next morning, the father arrived at the angry neighbor's house with Lisa and a few other committee members. The neighbor answered the door, looking surprised but not unwelcoming. The lawyer was already inside, sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers in front of him. The father took a deep breath and began. "We've finalized the neighborhood guidelines," he said, handing a copy to the neighbor and the lawyer. "We've tried to address everyone's concerns, including yours. I know we've had our differences, but I really believe this can work if we all commit to it." The neighbor glanced at the guidelines, then handed them to the lawyer, who began reading through them carefully. The room was silent as everyone waited for their response. Finally, the lawyer looked up. "These are reasonable," he said, his tone measured. They address many of the issues my client has raised. But I have to ask, what guarantees do we have that they'll be enforced? The father nodded, expecting this question. We've set up a system for reporting and addressing violations, he explained. It's not perfect, but it's a start. And we're committed to making it work. The neighbor leaned forward, their expression thoughtful. I appreciate the effort, they said slowly. But I've been through this before. People make promises, but they don't always follow through. How do I know this time will be different? The father hesitated, then said, You don't. But I can promise you this, we're committed to making this neighborhood a better place for everyone. And that includes you. If you're willing to give it a chance, we'll do everything we can to make sure these guidelines work. The neighbor didn't respond right away. They looked at the lawyer, who gave a small nod. Finally, they sighed and said, I'll think about it. But I'm not making any promises. The father felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. That's all we can ask for, he said. Thank you for considering it. The meeting ended on a somewhat positive note, but the father knew the situation was still fragile. As he walked home, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. They had come so far, but there was still so much uncertainty. Over the next few days, the neighborhood waited anxiously for the angry neighbor's decision. The father tried to stay busy, focusing on work and spending time with his family. But the tension was always there, just beneath the surface. Then, one evening, the father received a call from Lisa. I just heard from the lawyer, she said. The neighbor has decided not to sell their house, for now. They're willing to give the guidelines a chance. The father felt a surge of relief. That's great news, he said. Thank you for everything, Lisa. We couldn't have done this without you. Lisa smiled, even though he couldn't see it. You did the hard work. I just helped guide the process. But this isn't the end, it's just the beginning. You'll need to keep working at this to make sure it sticks. The father knew she was right. The real challenge would be maintaining the peace and ensuring that everyone followed the guidelines. But for now, he allowed himself to feel hopeful. They had avoided a lawsuit, and the neighborhood was still intact. That was something to celebrate. The next day, the father called a neighborhood meeting to share the news. When he announced that the angry neighbor had decided to stay and give the guidelines a chance, there was a collective sigh of relief. People clapped and cheered, and for the first time in months, the atmosphere felt light and hopeful. But the father knew they couldn't let their guard down. This is a big step forward, he said. But we need to stay committed to making this work. The guidelines are only as good as we make them. Let's show our neighbor, and each other, that we can do this. The neighbors nodded, and a few people volunteered to help with enforcement and organizing community events. It felt like the neighborhood was finally coming together, united by a common goal. As the weeks went by, the father noticed a gradual shift in the neighborhood. People were more mindful of noise levels and parking, and the angry neighbor seemed to be keeping to themselves. There were still occasional tensions, but they were minor and quickly resolved. One evening, as the father was out for a walk, he saw the angry neighbor working in their yard. He hesitated, then decided to approach them. Hey, he said, trying to sound friendly. How's it going? The neighbor looked up, surprised. Fine, they said curtly, but their tone wasn't as sharp as it used to be. The father nodded. I just wanted to say thanks for giving this a chance. I know it hasn't been easy, but I think we're headed in the right direction. The neighbor didn't respond right away. They seemed to be considering his words, then said, We'll see. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The father smiled and continued his walk, feeling a sense of accomplishment. They had come a long way, and while there was still work to be done, he felt confident that they could handle whatever came next. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly settled into a new rhythm. The guidelines the committee had worked so hard to create were now a part of everyday life. Quiet hours were respected, parking disputes became rare, and community events were organized with careful consideration for everyone's needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from the tension and conflict that had once dominated the block. The father noticed small but meaningful changes. The angry neighbor, while still reserved, no longer glared from their window or called the police over minor issues. They even waved back occasionally when someone greeted them. It wasn't much, but it was progress. The father took it as a sign that the neighborhood was healing, one small step at a time. One Saturday morning, the father decided to organize a neighborhood cleanup day. He had been thinking about it for a while, wanting to bring everyone together for a positive, shared purpose. He sent out flyers and posted notices in the community group chat, inviting everyone to join in. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Even the angry neighbor, to everyone's surprise, agreed to participate. On the day of the cleanup, the father woke up early to set up. He placed trash bags, gloves, and water bottles on the sidewalk, ready for anyone who showed up. Slowly, neighbors began to arrive, some with their kids, others with gardening tools. The atmosphere was light and friendly, filled with chatter and laughter. The angry neighbor arrived a few minutes later, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a pair of gloves. They didn't say much, but they joined in, picking up litter and pulling weeds along the curb. The father noticed and walked over to them. "Thanks for coming," he said, smiling. "It means a lot." The neighbor nodded, their expression neutral but not unfriendly. "It's a good idea," they said simply. "The neighborhood looks better when we all pitch in." The father felt a surge of hope. It was the first time the neighbor had acknowledged the value of community effort. He decided not to push the conversation further, not wanting to ruin the moment. Instead, he simply nodded and returned to his own tasks. As the morning went on, the father couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The neighborhood was coming together in a way he hadn't seen before. Kids were laughing as they raced to fill their trash bags, adults were chatting and sharing stories, and even the angry neighbor seemed to be enjoying themselves, albeit quietly. By midday, the cleanup was finished, and the street looked spotless. The father gathered everyone together and thanked them for their hard work. "This is what our neighborhood is all about," he said. "Working together to make it a better place for all of us. Let's keep this spirit alive." People clapped and cheered, and a few neighbors suggested making the cleanup a regular event. The father agreed, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It felt like they had turned a corner, and the future looked brighter than ever. Later that evening, as the father sat on his porch enjoying the cool breeze, he noticed the angry neighbor walking by. They paused for a moment, then turned and walked up to the porch. "Mind if I sit?" they asked, their tone hesitant. The father was surprised but quickly nodded. "Of course. Have a seat." The neighbor sat down, looking out at the street. For a few moments, they were silent, then they said, "I wanted to thank you." The father raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not giving up on me," the neighbor said, their voice quiet but sincere. "I know I haven't been easy to deal with. But you kept trying, even when I didn't make it easy. That means something." The father felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't expected this, and it caught him off guard. "I just wanted to make things right," he said. "For all of us." The neighbor nodded. "I get that now. I've been through a lot, and I guess I let it make me bitter. But seeing everyone come together today, it reminded me of what a neighborhood can be. I'm not saying I'm perfect, but I'm willing to try." The father smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. That's all anyone can ask for. We're all a work in progress, right? The neighbor chuckled, a rare sound that made the father's smile widen. "Yeah, I guess so." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The street was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the tense silence that had once filled the air. It felt like a new beginning. As the neighbors stood to leave, they turned to the father and said, "Thanks again. For everything." The father nodded. "Anytime. We're neighbors, after all." The neighbor smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile, and walked back to their house. The father watched them go, feeling a sense of closure. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. They had faced challenges, made mistakes, and learned from them. And in the end, they had come out stronger. The next morning, the father woke up feeling lighter than he had in months. He stepped outside to get the newspaper and noticed something new on the angry neighbor's lawn. A small garden had been planted overnight. Bright flowers bloomed in neat rows, adding a splash of color to the street. The father smiled, knowing it was a sign of hope. The neighborhood had weathered the storm, and now they were blooming, just like the flowers. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a new chapter, one filled with promise and possibility. As he went back inside, the father felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had come a long way, and while there would always be challenges, he knew they could face them together. After all, that's what neighbors were for.